The Reverend Michael Renninger is the pastor of St. Mary's Catholic Church in Richmond, Virginia. He's a very gifted preacher and often regarded as one of the best storytellers in that area and even beyond. It's been my privilege at times to hear and watch Michael Renninger tell his stories and interweave those into a gospel message. So I'd like to begin this morning by sharing with you a story that he tells about his grandparents. And we'll interweave that story with the story of Jesus during that last Holy Week. I'll rely on some comments from one of my dearest pastor friends, Dr. Bob Browning, and then with your encouragement and help, we'll share this message together. Michael Renninger tells about his grandparents, and they lived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They were blue-collar workers. They worked hard, made a good living, didn't have a lot from the perspective of earthly riches, but from spiritual resources, they were very, very rich. They raised 6 children in that modest home, and they taught their children to love God and to love the church and to love each other. Michael Renninger said he and all of the grandkids, and there was a plethora of them, you can imagine, because they had 6 children, they were blessed to have their grandparents as their grandparents. So this particular story took place when Michael Renninger was a 19-year-old freshman. He was away from school. And his grandparents, who had worked hard all of their lives, reached that point in life where it was time for them to retire. So upon their retirement, they decided, at least for them, to splurge just a little bit, which was very, very rare because they really kept track of their expenses. So his grandfather went out and he bought a deluxe reclining lazy boy chair, just what he wanted. And he set it right in front, in the front room of their old Zenith television. And there he decided that for much of his retirement, he would lean back into that recliner and watch his beloved Philadelphia Phillies lose yet another game. They were not that good back in 1982. And Michael says that even with the grandkids running around, sometimes his grandfather would get so frustrated that he would use some peppery language trying to cheer on his beloved Phillies. But that was his splurge in retirement, that reclining chair and watching his Phillies. Well, the grandmother, she decided that she was going to take up bingo. And I don't mean that she took up bingo. She almost became bingo. In fact, she was known in that area as the queen of bingo. She would go to her own parish on Monday nights and play. On Tuesday nights, she would go to the VFW hall. And on Wednesdays, she would even go to the Jewish synagogue, and she would play with her Jewish friends. And she loved going into the kitchen for the snacks and talking to her friends. She was the queen of bingo. There they are in their retirement, watching the Phillies in that reclining, probably lazy boy deluxe chair, and she's playing bingo. And she's still doing everything around the house, and he's still encouraging her, but that was their retirement until all too soon the bingo days had to stop. And even for a while, watching the Philadelphia Phillies from that reclining chair had to be altered because Michael's grandfather had a series of strokes. It left him completely paralyzed on the left side of his body. He could still hear, he could still see, but he couldn't talk. And he could only use the one hand, and he couldn't swallow. And so in order for him to receive the nutrients to remain alive, the doctors inserted a feeding tube. And it became the task of the lady who had been the queen of bingo to now become the permanent caretaker of her husband. So they took out the reclining chair. They brought in, still in that front room, a hospital bed. Oh, Zenith TV was still there. And Nanny Woods, the name of his grandmother, saw a new normal, if you could call it that, come into their lives. The liquid in the feeding tube was green. And all the grandkids started calling it the green goop. And so every day, can you imagine this? Every day, several times a day, Nanny Woods would feed her husband the green goop to keep him alive. And as best he could, he would watch the fillies, and the grandkids would still come, and they would talk about time for Granddad to get the green goop, and Nanny Woods would do that. One weekend, during his freshman year of college, Michael Renninger came home for a visit. He was about to visit his parents, but he decided to stop into his grandparents' house first. And so he parked his car across the street, walked across the street, up to the front porch, opened the squeaky screen door, and looked in and was shocked. Because there was his grandfather in that hospital bed, and he was red-faced, and he was gesturing with the one hand that he still had, and he was frustrated, and there was his grandmother, Nanny Woods, and she was doing all kinds of things to try to remedy the situation. And what had happened, something had gone wrong in the feeding process, and the green goop was all over the place. It was all over the grandfather. It was all over the bed. It was all over the room. It was all over Nanny Woods. She, as of yet, had not detected Michael's presence, and Michael, as a lot of 19-year-olds probably would do, in shock, backed away and started to just leave. But he forgot about the squeaky screen door. And his grandmother, perhaps because of the squeak in the door, perhaps because she just realized his presence, looked at her grandson and said to him in a loud voice, and she had never raised her voice to Michael before, or even to anyone before, and she said, "Don't you dare. Don't you dare leave, Michael. Don't you dare." And shocked and paralyzed himself, he walked back into the room. And as she cleaned up the green goop mess, she looked at her grandson and said, "Don't you dare leave, Michael, because sometimes love looks like this. Sometimes, Michael, love looks like this." You know, sometimes love looks lovely, doesn't it? When everything works out fine, even when the Phillies win, even when the Wildcats don't lose. I added that to the sermon today. So sometimes love looks pretty lovely. Those of us who love for a while, we know that sometimes love looks like a green goop mess. Don't you dare leave, Michael, because sometimes love looks like this. And she was right. I've been preaching since I was 19 years old. I'm 71, you can figure it out. I know I look like I started preaching when I was 5, but that's beside the point. And I want to tell you that over 50 plus years of preaching, I have preached on love numerous times. And I love it. I love it when love looks lovely. I love it when love looks like new parents holding up their newborn baby. I love that. I love it when I watch a bride and groom stand in front of the altar at church and exchange wedding vows to share life together as husband and wife. I love that. I love it when love looks like an elderly couple. In our church at Calvary, it was Cornelius and Thelma Reed. They were in their 90s. They're in heaven now, but they were in their 90s, and they would come to church and they would hold hands. And part of it, yes, was so that neither one of them would fall, but mostly it was because that even in their 90s, after 70 plus years of marriage, they were still so very much in love. I love it when love looks lovely. But for those of us who've tried to live in love for a lifetime, who try to love enthusiastically, who try to love as best we can in a Christ-like way, we know that love doesn't always look like that, does it? Love doesn't always look like that parent holding that cooey, cuddly, smiling baby, because that baby might get colic and keep the parents up all night. The only way they can calm their child, whom they love immensely, is just to hold and sing and hum and walk the floor. And the baby sleeps soundly and the parents are exhausted. And sometimes love looks like that. And then that baby boy grows up and gets his driver's license. And it's the first time with his license that he goes off in a car by himself. And the parents are worried sick, and they sit there on the couch, and they are wondering and praying, will he get back home? And they stay up anxious and worrying until they hear the car in the driveway and the car door slam, and he comes in the front door. And sometimes love looks like that. And sometimes love looks like that little girl who grows up, and when she's 16 or 17, or if she's really persuasive with her parents, 15, and she goes out on a date for the first time. Her curfew is 11:30, her parents have said, and 11:30 comes and she's not there. 12 o'clock rolls around, still not there. 12:30, where in the world, what has happened to our girl? And all kinds of thoughts go through their mind. And finally at 1 o'clock, she enters the home. And as best they can, with discipline and grace, sometimes love looks like that, doesn't it? Love's not always lovely. Sometimes love looks like a green goop mess. Sometimes love looks like getting up early in the morning so that you can get to your job on time. You're up before anybody else in the house is because you want to make a good living for your family. And sometimes love is getting up that early, or maybe sometimes even before, and you're making sandwiches for everybody in the family so that they can have a good lunch. And sometimes love looks like that. And sometimes love means starting over. And sometimes love means just just getting through the day. Sometimes love means being willing to forgive yet again. And sometimes love is a 70-plus-year-old woman cleaning up the green goop that has spilled all over her bedridden husband. Now, sometimes love does not look all that lovely, does it? Or as my friend Bob Browning has said, marriages are not always the same as weddings, are they? Parenting is not like the pictures that you always post on Facebook or the photos that you store on your iPhones. Friendships are not always as mushy as Hallmark cards. Recovery from addictions is never as swift and predictable as we hope it would be. Diseases are not always healed. Surgeries are not always successful. Communication doesn't always flow. Depression is not always manageable. Dreams do not always come true. No, sometimes love does not look lovely. Sometimes love looks like someone cleaning up the green goop. It's being right there in the middle of all of life's messes. Sometimes love says, "Don't you dare leave." Because sometimes love looks like this. Who is it that taught you what love really looks like in life? Maybe not so much by their words, maybe that, but especially by their actions. Who is it in your life that taught you how to really love? Close friend, teacher, parent, grandparent, coach, minister? Who is it that has taught you what real, authentic, Christ-like love really looks like? So perhaps this week that we dare to call holy, before it slips by, that in our prayers and in our thoughts, we would reflect on those people and give thanks to those people who really taught us how to love. And perhaps in this holy week, you could ask God to help you have that kind of authentic, Christ-like love too. Don't you dare, Michael Renninger's grandmother said. Don't you dare, she said as she looked up, covered with that green goop. Don't you dare leave, Michael. Don't you dare, because sometimes, son, love looks like this. Hey, it's true that sometimes love does look lovely, doesn't it? Sometimes it looks like birthday parties and Christmas mornings and Thanksgiving dinners and weddings and baptisms and Palm Sunday parades. But sometimes love looks like what Michael Renninger's grandmother knew it could look like when life is messy and rugged and demanding and unrelenting and exhausting. When life is difficult and the way is hard, love just digs in its heels and rolls up its sleeves. Love doesn't open up the screen door and leave. The love of which we speak this morning is the kind of love that Jesus taught and that Jesus emulated. Sure, I think there were many occasions in Jesus' ministry when love looked lovely. When he was growing up in Nazareth, playing with his brothers and sisters and cousins and friends. When he went with Mary and Joseph to the temple and excitedly got to talk to the religious authorities so that he could learn more about his Father's business. It looked lovely for Jesus when he was learning the carpenter's trade from Joseph. When he was baptized by John the Baptist, when he was fellowshipping with his disciples, when he ministered to the outcast and marginalized and helped them up. When the crowds on that first Palm Sunday cheered for him, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is he who comes in the name of our ancestor David. And they threw their coats in his path, and they waved palm branches, and Jesus, in prophetic messianic fashion, rode on a donkey on his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And sometimes love looked lovely for Jesus. Yet as the event of the first Holy Week, folks, would declare, sometimes love looked like Jesus being betrayed and being arrested on a trumped-up charge and being convicted of a crime. Sometimes for Jesus, love looked like being brutally beaten, a scourging, and having a crown of thorns jammed into his head, and being forced to carry his cross to the place of the skull, and having nails driven through his hands and his feet, and being hoisted up in the air in a very humiliating public display, and being killed by crucifixion. If you want to know what real, authentic, agape love looked like for Jesus, just look to Calvary and just look at the cross. Love looked so lovely the first part of that Holy Week on Palm Sunday when Jesus made his triumphal entry, but by Holy Week's end, love for Jesus looked like anything but lovely. By Friday of Holy Week, love for Jesus looked like an old rugged cross. And if ever there was a time when Jesus would have been justified in opening the screen door and running the other way, it would have been that night in the Garden of Gethsemane. Lord, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. But he didn't run, did he? He stayed. Why didn't he run? Because Jesus knew what real love looks like. And sometimes it looks messy and even horrific. And sometimes it really does look like an old rugged cross. I am the good shepherd, he said. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. And on Friday of Holy Week, that's the kind of love that Jesus modeled. As you prepare to celebrate Christ's resurrection next Sunday morning, be sure that you still take a good long look at the cross, because it reminds us of the one who didn't open the door and run. It reminds us of what real love looks like. You know, my love doesn't always look like that. Does yours? Sometimes we cut and run. And sometimes we grow weary and say, enough of this stuff. And sometimes we run away from the green goop and we let other people clean up the messes. But still, Jesus calls upon us to try. Love one another as I have loved you, he said. By this will all men know that you are really my disciples if you have authentic love for one another. That you love one another as I've loved you. That you also love one another. Don't you dare. Don't you dare leave, because sometimes Michael, sometimes Bob, sometimes Mary, sometimes Deborah, sometimes love looks like this. And I am grateful that Jesus, during that first Holy Week, did not open the screen door and run away. I am grateful for the people in my life who stuck with me when life got difficult and I messed up. And I'm grateful for the opportunity that I have, that we all have, to share this kind of love with others. Don't you dare. Don't you dare leave Holy Week without looking at the cross. Don't you dare leave, because sometimes love looks like this. Always, always, love looks like Jesus. Sometimes, on our best days, love looks like us.